Safeguard Our Flank, Chapter 9, Part 17. The Result and Lessons Learned. The total casualties on the Somme were over 1,300,000, divided equally between the Allies and the Germans. The battle finally ended on the 14th of November 1916. British losses were 400,000. The 56th Division suffered grievously. The figures speak for themselves. The attack on the Kern redoubt was successfully accomplished the following year. The casualties on the first day of the battle were: the 1st London Rifles lost 19 officers and 553 men. The 1st London Scottish lost 14 officers, 544 men. The Queen's Westminsters, 28 officers and 475 men. The Queen Victoria's, 20 officers and 400 men. The 1st Kensington's, 16 officers and 300 men. Lieutenant General Rawlinson attacked with 13 divisions on a front 15 miles long, and the French with 5 divisions on a front of 8 miles, mainly south of the river, where the German defence systems were less highly developed. The unconcealed preparations on the Gommecourt front and the long bombardment starting on the 24th of June had given away any surprise. This was part of the battle plan envisaged by Generals Haig and Rawlinson. Later findings confirm that the Germans knew they were going to be attacked and had a good idea when, how and why. Their knowledge and guesses confirms the deception plan was working, which was in accordance with the wishes of the British General Headquarters and part of the grand strategy. The more unsure and on edge the Germans were made to feel, with numerous excursions to their front, the better. These diversions would help the main British attack, drawing away possible German attention, reserves and resources. No general worth his salt would plan a campaign without such a plan in place. This was not clever, but proper military thinking. The German troops taking part in the defence numbered 24,000 men. They suffered 601 casualties. Of these, 185 were killed. Most of the attacking British battalions lost half their men. Each battalion had about 800. According to General Farrar Hockley, see Somme, published in 1966, on the morning of the 1st of July at 7:15, German observation stations reported a smoke screen developing on both sides of the salient. Although the British bombardment had been intensified since 6:25, the German fire trenches facing northwest, the Stafford's front, were not being shelled. Several German observers of the local 91st Reserve Regiment came up from their deep dugouts to see what on earth was happening. To their front, the ground ran level to the Stafford's lines, 400 to 500 yards distance, beyond the village of Fonquevillers. On their front, on their right, the one-time Succory. Christopher Moore's Trench Fever proclaims that by 9 o'clock the commander of the Staffords, Brigadier General Williams, knew that any of his men surviving would not resume the attack. They'd have enough. They had been shot down like dogs. The 5th Leicesters, who were there in support, were told the artillery was being called for a further shoot, and that his job was to organise another wave attack. Major General Wortley personally took charge, realising that a firm hand was necessary to see that it was carried out. The Sherwood Foresters were on the left, and the Staffords and 5th Leicesters on the right, It was to be a repeat of the morning's attack, preceded by an artillery barrage and smokescreen, planned for a start at 12:15. This new attack was delayed a number of times because the communication trenches were clogged up with the dead and wounded. Stretcher bearers were ferrying the injured away, and resupply parties struggling forward, each jostling each other as they tried to get past. All along the 46th front, collapsed trenches were under shell fire. The previously heavy rains had washed away the battered sides, making the trench shallower. At 3:30, the British artillery commenced their bombardment, and the few Stokes mortars added their smokescreen too. On the left, the smoke was so thin that Brigadier Shipley of the Sherwoods ordered his men to stay just exactly where they were, knowing that it would be slaughter if the attack went forward. The Staffords, seeing that the Sherwoods were not getting out of their trench and shell holes, refused to go forward, as did the 5th Leicesters. It was stalemate. No one moved. The German artillery, being informed that the British bombardment had started up again and a smokescreen created, prepared another shoot. Now they were fully alert, thinking that this was going to be another attack. They redoubled their efforts, sending down a shrapnel barrage which caused even more casualties to the wounded men. There were those huddling in shell holes, waiting for a chance to get back to their own lines, and the sheltering advancing troops waiting for an inspired officer to lead them forward. By 4 o'clock, Lieutenant General Snow knew that the 56ths were being slowly pushed back, and the 46ths had stalled. He concluded the attack to link up was not going to happen, so instructed the attempt to be called off and the original British front line re-established and remanned. The diversion had been made and achieved, but the hope of joining up, of straightening the line to eliminate the salient, had to be abandoned. From now on there would be recriminations. Who was going to pay the price for failure was not so clear. Was it the plan, the planners, or the poor bloody infantry? Considering the attack had been purely a diversion and not meant to break out, the effort by the Territorials had been very costly. The grand plan to help the French was a noble one, and its aim strategically necessary. However, war's simple object to remove the enemy was not achieved. Rawlinson's insistence on a lengthy bombardment to soften German resistance was an acceptable strategy. If it had been achieved, it wasn't because the necessary weapons were not at hand. Haig had preferred a shorter preliminary bombardment and the adoption of skirmishing infantry tactics. This may have worked better. Haig's deferment to Rawlinson's greater experience and fears were in error. No frontline soldier would ever limit artillery bombardment to his enemy given the chance. However, this presupposes that the artillery will achieve all its targets and purposes. In this instance, the artillery failed miserably. Their expertise at reducing specific targets was pathetic, and their wire-cutting skills hopeless. They were not up to the task. This was not necessarily their fault. They were just not properly trained, nor did they have the proper weapons or shells. These deficiencies should have been exposed before the battle by Rawlinson. It was, after all, his plan. The artillery's goals were an integral part of his plan and had to be achieved. The gunners were quite incapable of backing the infantry, although they thought at the time they were doing a good job. The observers could see the targets putting up a shower of earth and smoke, but this was simply surface material. The dug-in and reinforced bunkers and the weapons pits were hardly being touched. The Germans, purposely alerted to the coming attack, had retired most of his troops back to the rear trenches, some even to his third trench on the road. That the British had only 60 howitzers along the whole front speaks volumes, for only howitzers are produced to project shells to fall vertically, a trajectory necessary to puncture dugouts and penetrate the top cover of weapon pits. Brigadier Scott's presentation, Artillery Survey in World War I, on January 2003 at Woolwich, maintains Britain was not prepared for war in 1914. The artillery had 18-pounder guns and 4.5-inch howitzers with which to raise gun positions and men in dugouts, and such weapons are only suitable for targets in the open. For the battle on the Somme, Rawlinson had only 105 heavy guns. General Farrar Hockley, in the Somme, maintains 107 guns. And howitzers, by the previous June, 36 60-pounder guns, 8 6-inch guns, 40 old 6-inch guns, howitzers, 4 8-inch howitzers, 14 9.2-inch howitzers and 3 15-inch howitzers. Scott maintains the state of the maps were poor, and that using flash to bang to determine range was inaccurate. Lieutenant General Allenby, commander of the British Third Army, later authorised a flash spotting course. The battle relied upon air reconnaissance to locate enemy guns. Commander of the Second Army ordered counter-battery work must be a matter chiefly for the heavy artillery, and the enemy gun locations allocated to the artillery intelligence officer and his assistants attached to each group commander. This brought into being the start to official counter-bombardment systems. By the 1st of July, each army had a flash spotting observation section of the then 1st Field Survey Company, continuously manned, connected to observation posts by telephone. However, it took some time for the spotting information to be passed up to the Corps counter-battery officer and down to a gun battery. According to Brigadier General Sir James Edmonds, Royal Engineers, Official History of the Great War Volume 1, and the British guns fired the British guns fired 20,000 tons of metal from the start of the battle on the 24th, which was in total 1,627,824 shells of all types. Christopher Moore maintains in Trench Fever perhaps 1/3 were duds. What is clear from official records is that most of the shot were shrapnel, unsuitable to raise dug-in position. Owing to the dense and rigid infantry tactics, the wave system employed by Rawlinson, the losses were unnecessarily heavy. Rush and drop, cover and deploy are the skills of a skirmisher using the terrain. Such tactics might have achieved more. In this instance, it most certainly had been no worse, and possibly better. Giving advancing troops the option of reaching a certain position using whatever tactics the situation demands on the day can have a better result, if resolutely carried out. It was in this that Rawlinson had his doubts. He believed the territorial's resolve and skills were wanting.